Hi, friends. This is Joe, and this is episode number 188 of the Decahedron RPG podcast. And today we are talking about tunnels and trolls. I got a message on YouTube from a gentleman named Marcus, and he said, "This is the first time I'm ever hearing about tunnels and trolls. What is it?" So, Marcus, this is for you. So first of all, thanks, Marcus, for answering that. And secondly, I'm going to talk about a bit of the history of tunnels and trolls, and then I'm going to talk about the game itself, the rules. And if you're watching and you want to skip the history part, I'm going to put a timestamp right here, probably there, for what when the game rules parts begin. But history-wise, I don't want to oversell this, but Tunnels and Trolls is the cause for the entire RPG industry. It's that simple. That's what I think, at least. You're going to say, "Hey, Joe, but wasn't Dungeons and Dragons the first RPG?" Yes, it was. And it was one game produced by one company, and nobody else was making any RPGs. And it wasn't until Flying Buffalo and Ken St. Andre started making Tunnels and Trolls that other companies were like, "Hey, we can make our own role-playing game and we can sell it without getting sued." So it was Ken and Rick. Rick Loomis was the owner of Flying Buffalo. Ken St. Andre is the author of Tunnels and Trolls, game designer, all that. And it wasn't until they set that path, that they opened those floodgates, that everybody else felt that they could like jump in and start producing their own stuff, that TSR did not have a monopoly on, "Hey, let's pretend with rules." All right, so that's the importance of it. So Tunnels and Trolls was first published in 1975. The first edition was just some copies that Ken St. Andre put together and sold, at conventions or whatever. The next edition was picked up by Flying Buffalo, Rick Loomis. It was still just pieces of paper stapled together, but they sold those. And in fact, third edition and fourth edition were all still just staple bound. It wasn't until fifth edition that it got a proper binding, if you will. So Tunnels and Trolls is widely credited as being the second RPG to market. And there's a whole big asterisk there. And I'm going to explain what the challenges to that claim are and why I think, it's still the second. So we know for absolute certainty that the second RPG to be published was a game called The Rules to the Game of Dungeon. And this was in Minneapolis. And again, it was papers bound. So why don't I count this one? Well, two reasons. One is that it was published in an APA, an Amateur Press Association. If you listened to the show before, you know I'm a huge fan of the APAs in general, and I run one myself. It's called the Anchorite Amateur Press Association. But does that count as publication? I don't know. He was also going to print off 50 copies and take them to Worldcon, and I think to put on the freebie table or something. But I don't know if he ever did that, because after he put it in the APA, other people in the APA started saying, "Hey, this is a lot like, that Dungeons and Dragons thing." And it was like, "Oh, what's that?" And so yeah, because he learned the game from somebody else who ran it, and that person learned it from some, you know what I mean? And yeah. So the next game that might be a challenge then is M.A.R. Barker's Empire of the Petal Throne. M.A.R. Barker also made a limited 50 copy print run of this game, again in Minneapolis. You're saying, "Hey, Joe, what's with all these games in Minneapolis?" Minneapolis is where Dungeons and Dragons was born. I know a lot of people think, no, it was Lake Geneva in Wisconsin. No, it was Minneapolis in Minnesota. That's where Dave Arneson ran the first fantasy campaign, Blackmore. And he and one of his players went over to Lake Geneva to teach Gary Gygax how to play. And from there, Gygax and Arneson worked together to make D&D. But Minneapolis is the birthplace of the hobby, and it actually even goes further back to Dave Wesley and Brownstein, but we're getting off topic now. So anyway, M.A.R. Barker made Empire of the Petal Throne, which had this deep, immersive fantasy world. but the rules were Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, there were some changes here. He made changes to the character classes to match what fit in his world better, and he changed the experience points to 50 per hit die instead of 100 per hit die. Little things like that, but the game was Dungeons and Dragons. It was so much Dungeons and Dragons that TSR was going to sue. And what they eventually settled on was that TSR would buy the rights and that TSR would sell them independently. Yeah. So I don't count that one because it's not a standalone game. It is a standalone game. It's not a separate game. It's just Dungeons and Dragons with a game world incorporated. Tunnels and Trolls was the first game that did not come out of Dungeons and Dragons zeitgeist there. Although, to be fair, it did come out of Dungeons and Dragons because Ken St. Andre said he was at a friend's house on game night and they were playing this game. And he was like, oh, that's really cool. What is that? And he flipped through the books and it was like, this is a mess. And if you've ever read the original Dungeons and Dragons rules, you know that they are. And he said, I could do this better. So he gave the rules back, and legend says that he produced Tunnels and Trolls from what he remembered about the game and how it should be. And he made a lot of changes, so much so that I think that it is a distinct and separate game. Furthermore, it was picked up commercially by Flying Buffalo and published, and I think that's what sets it apart from the rules to the game of Dungeon. Which again was Dungeons and Dragons filtered through 3 people before it hit the guy that wrote it. And Empire of the Petal Throne, which again was Dungeons and Dragons. So what is Tunnels and Trolls from a rules perspective? What makes it different from D&D? Well, let me give you a brief overview. And yeah. So first of all, stats. Just like D&D, there are 6 stats. The only difference is that in Tunnels and Trolls, there is no wisdom. It's been replaced by luck. Oh, by the way, when I talk about Tunnels and Trolls here, I'm going to be talking mainly about the earlier editions, 1 through 4, because they're the closest to D&D. As the editions go on, there's not a whole lot of changes. I think there's like 10 editions in all, more if you count Monsters and Monsters like I do. You might even want to count Mercenary Spies and Private Eyes as sort of a modern day Tunnels and Trolls. But I'm going to talk about the earlier editions, and then I'm going to add on information from the later editions as I think about them. So 6 stats, took away wisdom and replaced it with luck. Now, I think this is genius for a couple reasons. First of all, in the early days of the hobby, intelligence and wisdom were both there, but a lot of players really had no, what is the real difference between intelligence and wisdom? Yes, intelligence is magic users, wisdom is clerics. But I mean, if you come across a mental challenge of some sort, which one do you roll on? Now, as the years went by, the decades went by, D&D defined them a little better. And so people have a rather clear understanding which is which. But still, if you think about them, a lot of times when people ask for a wisdom check, I still think an intelligence check would probably make more sense. Anyway, by limiting these 2 very closely related stats and just having intelligence, it made it very clear. Oh, you need a mental type roll on intelligence. So it was brilliant for that reason. The second reason why it was brilliant was luck. It makes so much sense. As Ken has said in the past, an adventurer doesn't need to be wise. He needs to be lucky. If you read a lot of like the Conan stories and stuff, right? Luck plays a big part. Conan is always lucky. So luck is just this great stat. And even from a gaming perspective, it's great because when you reach the situation, like the party says, hey, we're in the woods. Is there a tree I can climb that's high enough to give me a good look over the canopy? You didn't plan that out as a GM. You know you didn't. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. I don't know. How are you lucky? Make a luck check and then you find out. That's a great way to do it. It's a great stat for things like that. So those are the stats. But how they're used is a little bit the same, a little bit different. Strength is used as a modifier for combat, just like in D&D. Dex is used as a modifier for combat. D&D does it for ranged combat, and it does it to add to your armor class. Armor works very differently in Tunnels and Trolls, so yeah, kind of the same. Luck is a modifier for your combat rolls. Where was I? There's intelligence. Podcasting is serious work, people. Don't try it out. Intelligence. Intelligence, much like D&D, intelligence is the domain of the spellcaster. Intelligence is the domain of the spellcaster in Tunnels and Trolls. It's used mainly to determine what level of spells you can cast. Every spell level, first level spells require so many intelligence. Second level spells require X number, goes up a little bit for every spell level. Dexterity, by the way, does the same, because in Ken's mind, magic is the words you speak and exact gestures of your hand. Your finger has to be like right there on your thumb, and your other fingers have to be exactly in those positions, and a little off is different. So without that dexterity, you can't cast spells. That's another way I envision magic, but hey, it works. Okay. Strength, intelligence, luck, dexterity, constitution. Constitution is your hit points in Tunnels and Trolls. Unlike D&D, where your constitution modifies your health points, maybe. In Tunnels and Trolls, it is if your con is 10, you have 10 hit points. If your con is 18, you have 18 points. If your con is 3, you can only take 3 hits, and then you're going to go down. So con is very important. The only thing that leaves is charisma. In D&D, charisma was always there, but kind of unused. Everybody used it as a dump stat. Exactly the same thing in Tunnels and Trolls. So that's the stats. Again, so we're very close to D&D here. But here, when we get to classes, we're going to diverge a little bit. But still not a lot, because when you think about OD&D, right, there's 3 classes. You had your fighter, your cleric, and your magic user. Your fighter is your guy with no magic. Your magic user is your guy with a lot of magic. And your cleric is a guy that's somewhere in between. He's kind of like a warrior. He can wear the armor. He can use the weapons. In fact, in some editions of Dungeons & Dragons, it says that a cleric is a member of a fighting order, which means that he is a fighting religious order, which means that he is a fighter who has taken religious vows. In other words, he's your holy warrior. This is why I argue that we don't need a separate paladin class, because that is what the cleric is. But I'm getting off topic. Tunnels and Trolls took it a little differently. So first of all, Ken St. Andre is an atheist, and he didn't want religion in his world. From my point of view, I think it's nice. I played with a lot of people that were just the opposite, and they were very religious. And when you use real world religions in the game, that gets a little iffy. Or if you make up fake religions, then that gets a little iffy for them, right? Because if I'm playing a cleric that worships that god, am I right? And that's their belief. And why alienate them, right? So Ken St. Andre just did away with it altogether. There are no clerics in Tunnels and Trolls, at least not as a playable class. Of course, in your game world, you can do anything you want. So what he did is he has the fighter and he has the magic user. He calls them wizards, which is a better title in my mind. And in between them, that in between class, he called them rogue wizards. And these are wizards just like the other wizards, but they were never a member of the guild, the Wizards Guild, or maybe they were in and they got kicked out. That might make for a neat little backstory. Or maybe they were in an apprenticeship and their master got mad at them and dismissed them from service, or maybe the master got kicked. A whole lot of things you could do with that. It's fun. Anyway, so rogue wizards, they're called rogues for sure. Short, which means that people coming in from other games, they have a whole different concept. What they think the rogue is, they think it's like a thief. It's not. It is a rogue wizard. It is a type of wizard. But anyway, because they're in between, they didn't miss out on all that weapon training, everything like the normal wizards did. So they're better at fighting than a wizard. Still not as good as a warrior. And they can cast spells, which a warrior can't, but they're not as good as a wizard. So they're in that middle ground that the cleric took in old D&D. That's it. Those are the three classes. Now, in later episodes, they add more classes. They add the warrior wizard, which sounds a whole lot like a higher level rogue to me, right? And they add these things called paragons, and it's just adding clutter, and it's not adding fun. I ignore them when I run Tunnels and Trolls. Speaking of later editions, I should have said when we were talking about the stats, in 5th edition, they introduced another stat called power. Nope, I lied. I should have said that in 5th edition, they introduced another stat called speed, which is just like it says, how fast you are. I don't like it. I don't use it. It does add to your combat adds, your combat bonuses. But, dexterity already does that. And like I was saying before, having both wisdom and intelligence was a little confusing in old D&D. I think that having speed and dexterity side by side is a little confusing. So it adds complexity and not fun. Ignore it. Get rid of it. Then in 5.5, they added power. And the purpose of power was for wizards to use this to power the spells. I'm going to be talking more about that when we get to the magic system. And then when 7th edition came out, they kept it, but they changed its name to Wizardry. Again, this was used to power spells. Before this, spells were powered by strength. And this led to a problem that some people had. I'm one of those people, by the way, where in order to be a more powerful wizard, you have to become stronger and stronger and stronger. So you're like Conan the Mage at some point. And that doesn't match my mental image of mages. It works for other people. It doesn't work for me. And so for people like me, Ken came out with Wizardry. And then to make sure it wasn't a dump stat for fighters, he came out with all these complicated rules about how fighters pretty much used it as like a magic resistance type thing. And it just, again, it's adding all this complexity without fun. I ignore all that. I don't use wizardry. I don't use power. I get around the whole luck. I get around the whole Conan the Mage thing by using luck instead of strength to power spells. All right. Anyway, classes took care of those. Races, big old list of races, but unlike D&D, they don't have rules where they say like elves get infravision or anything like that. All they do is give you pretty much stat bonuses and penalties. And unlike D&D, they're not adds or subtracts, they're multipliers. So if you're like an elf, I think your dex is 1.5 times whatever you rolled or something, which means if you rolled an 18, you could have a 27 dex starting out, which is weird if you're coming from D&D and have that mentality. All right. So stats, stats, class, race. We covered all those. Combat. This is where we go way off the tracks and we're no longer anything like D&D. So in Tunnels and Trolls, it is super simple. So first of all, D&D, in case you've never played, you roll to hit. If you hit, you roll damage. Then the bad guy rolls to hit. If he hits, he rolls damages. It's 4 rolls, right? 2 hit damage, you hit damage. And if you're facing 20 orcs, that's 22 hit rolls followed by 20 damage rolls. Right? A lot of rolling, whatever. Tunnels and Trolls makes it so much easier. You don't roll any to hit. You are a adventure book hero. Of course you're going to hit. You're facing these vicious opponents. Of course they're going to hit. Otherwise, it wouldn't be vicious. It'd be no fear. What's the point? So it's assumed that everything else being the same, that everyone's going to hit. So you just roll damage. So let's say I rolled 14 damage. And let's say the bad guy rolled 12 damage. That's what you look at is that difference, 14, 12. The difference is 2. And so he's going to take 2 damage because he rolled the less and the difference was 2. In my mind, this makes so much perfect sense, right? Because what you're rolling is how much capacity you had to do damage that turn, right? But because they also had this capacity, some of what you could have done is burned, right? By dodging and ducking and hiding and, getting out of the way and then trying to get back into position. And likewise for them, for all the damage you do, that comes off the damage they could have done. It makes so much sense. And it's really done on a side-by-side basis, because ever see those like 60s TV Westerns, bar brawls, right? You don't have this side and that side. Everyone's all mixed together and they're fighting each other, and like some good guys there, some there. And so instead of each person, okay, who are you paired up with? The whole side rolls, all the players roll, and you add that together as one total. So in essence, what you're saying is that this fighter who's really good is rolling this really high number, and the wizard is saying, assuming he's not casting a spell this turn, probably rolls a low number because he's not as good as it. But you're adding them together, so that's saying that the wizard is kind of covering for the fighter. The fighter's doing what he can, but the wizard's protecting him and stuff like that. It's great. It's brilliant. So just your whole side rolls, their whole side rolls, and you compare the totals for the sides. Okay, and then whatever side takes the damage divvies it up. I like it. Now, if you're one of those people, and there's a lot of people like that, I'm not faulting you. If you're one of those people that likes the tactical board game that modern D&D combat is, I'm in this square, the opponent's in that square, I can move 4 squares in a turn, and each roll represents like a single swing of the sword. This isn't that game. Right? You're not going to like this. This isn't going to appeal to you. I am not that person, though. I like this. Let's just find out what happened, which way is the battle going, because that way, if we're on the losing side, we can skedaddle, right? We can retreat. If we're on the winning side, we can press our advantage, whatever that. All that other stuff doesn't matter. I don't care. It's just noise. To me, that's the way I play. So Tunnels and Trolls combat system is tailored for people like me who want to get on with the role-playing, who want to get on with the exploration, who want to get on with the aftermath of the battle rather than the minutia of the battle itself. Perfect. I love it. Armor works differently because you're not trying to overcome an armor class now. So what armor is like, it's like wearable hit points, wearable constitution. So when you wear the armor, so in the example I gave earlier, I said like I rolled 14, he rolled 12, he takes 2 points of damage. If he's wearing like a leather shirt or something, that will absorb 1 point of damage, so he only takes 1. If he's wearing like plate or something, that's going to absorb all of it and he won't take any damage. In the earlier editions, once your armor took the damage, it was useless. You might as well get rid of it. In the newer editions, it takes that damage every round. I think that broke some things. So I like this kind of middle ground that I stole from another game called Tunnel Quest, where your armor soaks up that much damage every combat, and then it resets for the next combat. All right, enough of that. Armor, combat, magic. So Tunnels and Trolls does not use advancing magic. The D&D magic where you study a spell and it's in your head and you cast it and then it falls out of your head and you forgot about it for some weird reason that there is no good explanation for. I have read the paragraph out of Dying Earth. I have not read Dying Earth, but someone on a blog once put up the paragraph where that concept came from. I don't like it. So Tunnels and Trolls is made for people like me then, because they don't do that. What you do is you have spell points. And like I said, the early editions use strength. Later editions use wizardry or power. I use luck. But every time you cast a spell, you lose so many points. Every spell costs so many points to cast. And then that stat rejuvenates itself at like 1 point every 10 minutes. So if your spell costs 3 to cast, in 30 minutes, you'll be back up to full health. But every combat round is a minute. So, it's pretty much going to be like you have those spells for that combat round. And then, for that combat. And then next turn, hopefully you'll have time to recover them all. I like that a lot. So once you know a spell, you know it forever. It's not in a spell book. You don't have to go back and study it. You don't forget it. You know it. I like that. That appeals to me. That more matches my concept of a wizard. I said in another podcast before I started role playing, my concept of a magic user was like Samantha and Bewitched or Genie and I Dream of Genie or the wizard Arthur, Merlin in the Sword in the Stone Disney cartoon, right? And right, you don't see them running back to study their spell book to know a spell. Mind you, sometimes Samantha does look at a big book when she's doing something weird and obscure, but that's besides the point. Most of the time, it's just something she knows and she does it. So I like it. It works. It is, again, tuned to people like me. Anything? Oh, monsters. Yeah, let's talk about monsters. So D&D, of course, has the monster manual. Big book of monsters. And as you read the book, what you eventually learn is that most of the monsters are not, just here's their stats. There's some special ability they have. In other words, every monster breaks the rules in some bit, and that makes them interesting. T&T does not have that. In fact, T&T doesn't have a monster manual. It does have a list, and next to them is just this thing called a monster rating. And that's a one stat thing that you need for monsters. Kind of like hit dice. It tells you both how good it is at combat and how many hits it can take before it goes down. Yeah, it's a very different approach. Actually, I think D&D might be a little superior in this approach than Tunnels and Trolls, if I'm being honest, which I am. But it's still a good system. And you can also use just normal stats for monsters if you want to stat them out that way. I find that's beneficial for like boss monsters and stuff like that. And for special abilities, you then have to kind of make up your own rules as they come up, like dragon. A dragon using fire breath. Really, you just roll more damage for it that round than you would the other. But it's helpful to come up with other rules for other weird kind of monsters. But again, none of that is in the book. You've got to kind of make it. Trolls regenerating. That's not in the Tunnels and Trolls book at all. It just says trolls and it gives a monster rating, which I think is 60 or something. I don't know. Yeah, so monsters are very different. So while we're talking about things that D&D does a little better, I will also say Tunnels and Trolls doesn't have any list of magic items. It has a very small little price list. Oh, like the other neat thing about Dungeons & Dragons is it tells you that this kind of monster will generally have this kind of treasure. And there's nothing like that for the monsters, right? It's more world stuff than it is rule stuff, but that stuff also makes it very easy for a GM to prep and run a game without having to worry about, am I giving out too much treasure? Am I not giving out enough? Am I being, Monty Hallish? Should this ogre have a 5 gold piece treasure or a 5,000 gold piece treasure? There's no guidance for that at all in Tunnels and Trolls. So a win on the D&D side. But, these days and age, this day and age, everybody already has D&D of some edition or something. And so I find it useful to take information out of one of those games and use that over on the T&T side. Is there anything else to talk about in Tunnels and Trolls? Where is it now? So like I said, there's been a bunch of editions, right? There was 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 5.5, 7. There was never a 6. Long story there. Not going to go into it here. 7.5, and then Deluxe, which we call 8. So that's 9 editions. There was this other game called Monsters, which is pretty much just Tunnels and Trolls, but told from the monsters' point of view. And there were some editions of that, 2 editions that I can think of, 3 maybe. So, yeah. Like I said, Rick Loomis ran Flying Buffalo. He was the publisher for many years. He published 1 through 5.5, and he published Deluxe. 7 and 7.5 were published by this other company under license called Fiery Dragon. Okay. Rick Loomis passed a few years back. Sad. He was a great guy. And all the Flying Buffalo stuff was sold off, including the rights to Tunnels and Trolls. So Ken St. Andre doesn't own them anymore. Flying Buffalo doesn't exist anymore. There's another company that holds the rights that says they're coming out with a new edition. Jason over at the Nerds RPG Variety Cast, he's very nervous that they're going to ruin the game. I don't think they will. Maybe I'm just more of an optimist and he's more of a pessimist. But even from a business point of view, Tunnels and Trolls doesn't carry the name weight that Dungeons and Dragons does. You're not going to get a lot of nostalgia buyers from it, or rather, those are the only people you're going to get for it. And so if you radically change the game, those nostalgia buyers are going to be off-put and they're not going to buy it. And new people aren't going to buy it because of the name. So there was no point in buying the name to come out with a completely different game. So I'm hopeful. But if you're going to drive through RPG, you can buy the first edition rules, which I think are awesome, for like $1. They may have gone up since I've looked. They used to be, the first edition was $1, the third edition was $3. In either case, I still think they're $5 or below, and you can get them. I think Deluxe is on there, but it's expensive. I don't think it's worth the extra money personally, but that's me. Ken St. Andre sells his own version of Monsters now. I have not looked at it. I cannot tell you how good it is or how bad it is. He has one called Humans, which is, if Humans existed as a standalone product and not as a Monsters tie-in, and it was suitably priced, I would buy that, I think. Maybe we can buy them and call it Humans and Monsters. Anyway. But yeah, if you go through drive-through, you can find them affordably. Not print copies, they're only PDFs. If you look at like eBay and stuff, it doesn't have the collector's market that D&D does, so you can usually pick them up really reasonably. So I personally think it's worth it. I love Tunnels and Trolls. I think it's the gameplay for what I like, as you heard, as I went through this episode. For my taste, it matches my taste a whole lot more than D&D does. I think it's worth a look. If you're a rules light person, Tunnels and Trolls is like the original rules light game, back before that was a word. If you're a rules light person, if you like fast, fun action, as opposed to rules lawyering and tactical minigame combat, try Tunnels and Trolls. I think there's even a free edition out there. It's like they used to give away on RPG a day. And really for the solos, I never mentioned the solos. TNT was known back in the day for the solo games. They were like the original Choose Your Adventure books. They weren't called that, and Choose Your Adventure is a trademark of somebody or else. But that format was invented by Rick Loomis for Tunnels and Trolls, and everybody else just copied his idea. He's the one that did it. Tunnels and Trolls is where that originated. So, whatever. All right, I've talked far long enough. I hope I answered your question. Thank you very much for sending it to me. And if I think about it when I am doing the show notes, I will put a link to drive-through for the Tunnels and Trolls products in there. But again, you can just go and look for Tunnels and Trolls. You know how to use drive-through. Thanks for watching and your listening. And until next time, happy gaming, happy life. Bye.
You like old school games, so why not talk about them in an old school way with the Anchorite APA. An APA is an amateur press association. Every 6 weeks, you send in a zine filled with whatever inspires you. Play reports, rules ideas, reviews, anything. We compile it with everyone else's into one awesome collection, and you get it delivered straight to you. Physical mail in the US, PDF elsewhere. It's more than a publication. It's a community. Be part of a tradition that's tangible, creative, and fun. Visit sites.google.com/view/Anchorite. The Anchorite APA. Your next great adventure starts here.